So again, you get to Jamestown, Virginia, which is the first colony. Now, the interesting part of it is that once they get there, the colonists, they find out, one, the land is difficult to work, right? They're not accustomed to the physical labor that it takes to actually, to actually cultivate that land, and then a lot of them either starved or fell to disease. Right. And so again, and this is where you get your Thanksgiving and everything else. And so you have the Native Americans, for what I think is called the Powhatan Confederacy, right? That saved them, through the winter. And so this is, these people knew how to work the land. Obviously they could hunt. And so they were able to help those Europeans, survive the winter. And as the story goes, we all know that it didn't turn out too well for them. And so even despite the help from the Native Americans, many of them will either continue to starve, or die from disease, right? And so now something great happens, right? They end up getting this crop called tobacco, right? And so tobacco is what's really fueling the colonization in terms of money and everything else. And so now you get to the point, man, I think they're moving about maybe, if you want to call it the drug game, right? They're moving about 15 million pounds, right, of tobacco, again, back to England, back to Europe. And the demand of it is so high that the wealth that they gain allows them to kind of spread from Virginia, as far as up to Maine and as south as Virginia, because the Carolinas and other territories will belong to either the Spanish or the French. So with the tobacco crop, they were able to expand, fairly quickly. And so now you get into, 1619, where African Americans begin to show up, at least from the Anglo perspective, right? You have the first ship that shows up with slaves, as they will say, 20-something odd Negroes, that would come in as slaves. Now, the funny part about it was that in Jamestown, Virginia, right, you have a split. You got the elite, which will be like in the Tidewater region, right? And these guys, they're the money makers, they're ballers. So before they came over from England, right, you had something called the headright system, right? And the headright system, again, this was a form, again, this was like I can't call it a caste system, but, again, it was a system on pretty much basically in layman's terms, the more money you got, the better things will work for you. So for people who could afford a ticket to the United States, where every ticket that they bought, they'll be guaranteed a certain acre of land. And for the men who could not afford it, right, they would have to work as indentured servants for 5 to 7 years, on somebody's land or plantation before they can have land of their own. And so when you fast forward, what happens is, obviously the wealthy men end up with the best land, and then all the indentured servants end up on the western frontier. And out there on the western frontier, one, the land is harder to work, and then, oh, by the way, you're surrounded by hostile Native American tribes.
For sure.